This video is going to cover the very basics of language acquisition. The main question in language acquisition is how exactly is language learned? And there have been a few theories. The first that was proposed was a learning theory, so this would come from people who believed in things like operant conditioning through reinforcement and punishment. Kids learn language, they would say. That kids learn to talk because they are taught. So for example, if you've had a small child in your life, you know that as they're learning words, they sometimes use inappropriate rules. For example, a lot of our verbs, you would add an ed to the end to make it past tense, but there are some irregular verbs that don't work this way. So for example, fight isn't fighted, it's fought. So often when kids are learning this ed rule, they'll apply it to everything and they'll say, "Mommy, I fighted it." And the mom will say, "No, you fought." And the idea is that by her repeating the correct way to say it, she's reinforcing, or in this case punishing, and saying, "No, you didn't do it right, do it this way." However, this really doesn't get at the subtleties of how language can happen so quickly in young children and how it is the case that they learn all of the rules, because you don't correct them for everything. And it's also the case that even when you tell that child, "No, it's fought," what do they say again? Oftentimes they'll say, "I fighted" again. So there's been another theory proposed by Noam Chomsky, who said that actually we're born with pre-wiring in our brain for language acquisition, and he referred to this pre-wiring as the language acquisition device, or the LAD. So Chomsky says kids learn to talk because their brains are wired that way. Genetically, we come into the world prepared to learn language. And we'll see some of the amazing feats in language acquisition that small children engage in that do seem to indicate that there is some kind of a propensity that's built into our genetics. So there's a lot of data that supports this particular theory. However, there are also some examples of children, often referred to as wild children, who because of severe neglect don't get exposed to language. And oftentimes these children don't learn language well when they're found later in life. So there always has to be some kind of exposure that's important, and we know this because both nature and nurture influence all of our behaviors, and language isn't any different. So there's been a supplement to the LAD theory that's the LASS, the Language Acquisition Support System. And this basically says kids need exposure to language to learn it. That means they have to hear other people talking their whole lives. Children who are in very neglected situations where they're cut off from human contact and don't get exposed to language aren't going to be able to learn language appropriately. So because we're sort of pre-wired, then we would expect language to be experience expectant development, meaning that we saw some of the same milestones across all children everywhere, and that is the case. So in a newborn, the kinds of communication that we see are things like the reflexive communications, crying in particular. And remember that we talked about how children are universal listeners, that they can hear all phonemes, and that we break down our language into motherese. Both of these discussions are related to language because they're both directly pertinent to how we learn language. From 2 to 6 months, however, babies start to increase their repertoire of noises and sounds beyond just crying. They start to gain a little bit more control over their vocal apparatus, and remember that when they do something accidentally that they like, they start to repeat it over and over again because of Piaget's sensory motor stage, substage 2. That same thing happens with language, where they might accidentally make a noise and then realize that they can repeat that noise over and over again, which is why often babies do make the same noise numerous times. They're not quite babbling here yet, though. They're not using phonemes like ba and me and ka and de. They're just making woo woo kinds of noises. At about 6 months, they do start to babble, and even closer towards 10 months, they start to do jargoning, which is using babbles in the place of words. So they might say ba and point to a bottle. They can't quite get the whole word out yet, but they're using a sound to represent something that they want. And like I had said before, by 6 months, children are no longer able to hear all the phonemes. And that has to do with brain wiring. Remember that we make new connections, synaptogenesis, with all of our experiences, and that if we don't use connections, we lose them. So because children don't hear all phonemes, remember no language uses all of them, then the connections for those phonemes actually will go away. This is an example of synaptic pruning. Around 10 to 12 months, the children are understanding very simple words, so it's probably the case that they understand language before they can actually use it, and they'll use pointing a lot to get what they want. Somehow we know that pointing means that we're indicating the particular item that our finger is pointed at. And then approximately a year is the first word. First words tend to be nouns, which is an interesting thing. It's very rare for a child to use a verb or an adjective as their first word. From about 13 to 18 months, the vocabulary is just growing steadily, so by the end of this period, they have about 50 words in their vocabulary. But at 18 months, something extraordinary happens. They have a vocabulary spurt, meaning they learn significantly large amounts of new words. And the way they do this is fast mapping. Fast mapping is an extraordinary thing where the infant's brains are primed, probably because of what Noam Chomsky says, that we have this brain device, the LAD, that's genetically dictated. Children are able to learn new words during this period simply having heard them one time. So if they see a new item, like they go to the zoo and they see a monkey for the first time, and they point at it and look at their mom to ask what it is, and the mom says, "Monkey," they only have to have heard that one time. They'll never have to ask again. They'll know monkey from here on out. So because they only have to hear words one time, they absorb a huge number of new words in this period and lasts a few months. So their vocabulary is going to double. And then at about 2 years, children should be talking in approximately 2-word sentences. And from this point, they then move into more complex short sentences and then eventually into full sentences. One idea that's pervasive in language development is this idea of whether there is a critical or a sensitive period for language development, meaning is there a window in which a child needs to learn language, and if they get past that period without learning language, they're never going to. The critical period hypothesis says that there is a definite cutoff, after which if a child has not learned how to speak, they never ever will. The sensitive period hypothesis is a little bit more soft. It says that there is a critical period, a window in which children are most primed to learn language. And if a child doesn't learn language in that particular period, then they're going to have an extremely hard time and probably never speak entirely normally after that. And both the critical and the sensitive period hypotheses have proposed puberty as this cutoff in language. And that has to do with some developments that happen in the brain at puberty. So Jeannie is an example of a wild child that I mentioned a little bit ago. She was a really unfortunate case of a young girl who was locked into a bedroom for her entire life until she was 13 and she was found. So she was severely neglected and not exposed to language. And when they found her, she couldn't talk. She was nonverbal. So there was research done to see if she could be taught language. And basically the research pointed to that she did learn lots of new words, but she was never able to put the grammatical structure of sentences together appropriately. So Jeannie really is support for the sensitive period hypothesis. When we think about language development, there are a couple of interesting subpopulations I want to point out. The first are bilingual children. A child who's bilingual is learning 2 languages or maybe even more simultaneously. So a true bilingual is somebody who speaks easily, fluently, and without an accent in multiple languages. So those of you who were raised in one language and then learned another language in high school, you're not the kind of bilingual that we're talking about here. Bilingual children are interesting because sometimes people are concerned about whether they're going to get confused. If you expose them to too many different languages early on, they're not going to know either of the languages very well. And there seems to be some support for the idea that it is more information for the brain to process when you're trying to learn 2 languages. So often, children who are being raised in a bilingual household do show slight delays in their language milestones. So they might not be saying that first word at exactly a year, or they might not be to 2-word sentences by 2 years. But that doesn't mean that they're going to show these delays their whole life. They do eventually catch up, and in the long run actually have better outcomes. But in terms of that experience expectant development that we would see from the LAD, we see the exact same pattern in bilingual children. So they have the same vocabulary explosion, for example. One perk, though, is that children are less egocentric when they're bilingual. We're going to talk in another lecture about egocentrism, where the idea that small children cognitively are not able to think about the world outside of themselves. So they think pretty much the world revolves around them, not because they're mean little kids, but because cognitively they can't contemplate that. Bilingual children actually get past the egocentrism stage quicker than children who are just monolingual. Another interesting subpopulation are deaf children, children who are born without being able to hear. Interestingly, deaf children go through the exact same stages of development in terms of things like babbling at 6 months. And it's probably the case that they're not going to verbally babble, because if they can't hear any sound, chances aren't that they're not going to be able to make those sounds either. But they start to babble with their hands, especially if they're raised in a household where sign language is used and they've been exposed to language, which ties back in with that LASS, that we have to have exposure. Children who are deaf who don't get exposed to sign language show some problematic delays compared to children who are deaf and do get exposed to sign language. So when they're babbling with their hands, they're actually making small subparts of signs in the same way that a hearing child would be using their vocal apparatus to make small sub noises like ba. Children who are deaf are doing the same thing with their hands. There are options for deaf children now. There are cochlear implants, which are basically surgically inserted into the child's brain to help make the connections to be able to hear. So more and more children are receiving these implants and not going through their lives unable to hear. There are some concerns from the deaf community about this, however. The deaf community doesn't think that there's anything wrong with being deaf and thinks that making children who are born deaf have these cochlear implants is unnecessary. But the larger point is that regardless of what kind of a language learner a child is, they go through the same stages for the most part, unless they're grossly neglected and not exposed to the language. So children seem to be genetically predisposed to speak.